as appropriate.
Right, and I talked with Tom Ross last week about the Infect deck, and he said that the card that really makes the deck tick is Invigorate. So that is the card to look out for there. Of course, Matt is playing Esper Stoneblade, and Tom leads with the Tropical Island. Matt sacks a fetch land here.
And cheap disruption, very critical against the Infect deck. It's a very explosive deck, capable of killing as early as the second turn in some cases. So every source of Plowshare, every discard spell, really critical for Matt in this matchup.
It's a lot of glare there. It looks like a polluted, Underground Sea. And as you said, going for the disruption.
So we see an Inquisition here, revealing Berserk, Invigorate, Misty Rainforest, 8th Month Nexus, Vines of Basswood, and a Wasteland.
If you were in Matt's shoes and you weren't sure what Tom was playing at this point.
The Berserk Invigorate gives away the secrets. The Tropical Island is a deceptive opening, but now remove all doubt about what you're playing against here.
Yeah, the surprise factor is gone. And of course, last week, Tom got a lot of that surprise factor, with people that did not have hand disruption.
Because there's a lot of places where Tom's deck looks like kind of a conventional, green-blue aggro tempo deck with some of the spell choices and dazes and what have you.
Matt Day takes the Invigorate, it looks like.
The most efficient of the pump spells available.
Right. Using the gain life ability, which is not relevant when you're killing them with poison.
Yes.
So, Tom sacks Misty Rainforest here. Grab another Tropical Island.
And Tom appears to have drawn Blighted Agent this turn, which gives him a pretty efficient threat to deploy.
Right. Another thing Tom mentioned is he liked to play the Boggles deck, and the problem with the Boggles deck is how few threats you have. So, finding one of his threats here is pretty important.
We've seen this with Naya Hexproof and Standard yesterday. Just the weakness of all these pump spell decks is they're really predicated on finding a threat. A lot of your opening hands don't produce one, and you're susceptible to some removal spells as well.
Leads to a lot of mulligan decisions. Matt plays land and passes.
We'll see if how much Tom wants to go for it here.
Right. It's interesting to see if they pull the trigger and, if they can read their opponent for disruption.
Tom with a Wasteland here, so wouldn't surprise me to see him Wasteland the Underground Sea to see if Matt has any action or any sort of response, and that's exactly what Tom does.
Looks like Matt does not. Tom going to get in there. Is that another Invigorate?
Yep. Ooh. So that brings it to a 5/5. And now Tom casts Berserk.
And if Matt doesn't have an answer here.
5 times 2 is 10, and that is a poison kill. So Tom Ross very quickly up a game here. Matt with Counterspell in hand, but the Wasteland kept him off of being able to cast it, and we are quickly on to game 2.
Wow. Tom Ross with the turn 3 poison kill.
So moving on to the sideboard here, I have Tom's in front of me. He's got a mishmash of some singletons here. We have a Swan Song, a Dispel, a Relic of Progenitus, a Misdirection, a Bajuka Bog, a Dismember, a Submerge, Verdian Corruptor, 2 Necropedes, a second Berserk, a Sylvan Library, and 3 Nature's Claims. Nature's Claim, another very efficient removal spell when you don't really care about your opponent gaining life, of course. I don't exactly know where Tom's going to want to go here, in part because he doesn't necessarily know what he's up against. All he's seen so far is Inquisition of Kozilek, an Underground Sea, and a basic island. So that could be an Esper deck potentially, or some variation of, blue-black control or a bug control list. I do think he's going to want additional threats, as he's likely to be slugging through more removal in the post-board games. And in that case, I like the Sylvan Library as well, giving him a little more staying power.
Right, and he might be able to take him off Bug with the basic island there, as Bug tends to run no basic lands, but again, like you said, it's very tough to figure out what he has. As for Matt, his sideboard contains a couple copies of Cabal Therapy, some Meddling Mages, Spell Pierce, a Pithing Needle, Humility, Surgical Extraction, Force of Will, a Notion Thief, got to get him with that, Zur's Wielding, Flusterstorm, Supreme Verdict, and a Sword of Fire and Ice.
So Humility is actually an interesting kind of one-card win against Tom.
Yes.
He has to try to go manual style dealing 20 with his now 1/1 creatures without infect. I think the additional removal, I think even something like Cabal Therapy is very good because Tom's deck, even though it's an attacking creature deck, if anything, more closely resembles a combo deck than anything in my mind.
And that's how he described it last week, that you're just trying to piece it together. He's even got a couple copies of Gataxian Probe to know when the path is clear to push in all that damage.
Yeah, we've seen some decks in Legacy that are, purportedly beatdown decks. They play with the creatures they intend on attacking with that actually have a pretty significant combo element to them. Burn has that characteristic. I would say Affinity has that characteristic, and so not uncommon to see the most aggressive decks in Legacy take on that kind of angle because you just don't have that much time in this format.
Yeah. And opposite of Boggles, though, his creatures are very targetable. So, with the removal being cheap, it's very important for Tom to know when the path is clear. Otherwise, he's just going to run.
Yeah, information's very key here. Right. As we saw, Tom, there's some risk there. He went for it in a pretty good spot, but, he doesn't really know the full extent of Matt's hand necessarily. Right. There are responses that Matt could have that could be disruptive there. And so that information is very valuable.
There is that give and take of, not wanting to wait too long because then obviously you allow them to find the disruption. But again, you don't want to run headfirst into it.
Yeah, it's very rare in Legacy that the waiting game is a positive thing to be doing, in part because of Brainstorm and Ponder. Mm-hmm. Your opponent doesn't just have their draw steps. They're often looking at multiple cards a turn through their cantrips. And often the best play with these sort of decks is to throw caution to the wind and just go for it when you feel like you have a good spot.
Yeah, and there are many decks, just from looking around the room today and many of the known archetypes that are like that. I mean, sometimes you can wait to play around the counter magic or the disruption, but a lot of times it's just jamming it. You're either throwing down a Blood Moon, pumping a guy up to 10 poison, sneak and show, all those types of decks.
The disruption is really just too cheap, and the cantrips are so efficient and powerful that time is not on your side. So you see a lot of, I'm going to put this person to the force of will test right here, or I'm going to make them have a spell pierce right at this spot because I don't think my odds get better if I continue to wait this thing out.
They definitely do not. And that's one thing I've really enjoyed about this job, just looking around the room, watching certain players that play these archetypes, which players have the read, which players will pull the trigger, and force their opponent to have it. And that kind of tension is something I enjoy.
In the Legacy especially. Standard has a small amount of that element as well, but Legacy, the decks are so much more polarized and the play patterns are so much more extreme that it really accentuates that feature even more.
Right. Tom, of course, writing about Infect on the select side, you can read his articles about that. He's championed that, and he's also played it in Modern. So a little less powerful in Modern.
Sure. Although I actually had a run-in at Grand Prix Portland with an Infect deck that actually killed me very easily. Actually, one game, embarrassingly enough, killed me with damage and then was able to do something very similar to what Tom just did. Not, of course, fueled by Invigorate and Berserk, but, by modern standards, very efficient. The Vines of Basswood still appears there. Might of Volcroza. There's a good litany of cheap, efficient pump spells. So, in fact, not really on anyone's radar in Modern right now, but Grand Prix Richmond coming up, and you never know. It's tough to rationalize playing that deck when Malira is a main deck feature of arguably the best deck in the format, but in fact definitely has his proponents.
Yeah, and trying to win through just damage alone, not a great path to victory for the Infect deck.
No.
We got to see, it was an off-camera match. Tom played, Ruben playing Painter, and he was trying to force in damage with Noble Hierarchs, and that just wasn't going to get it done.
So Matt will be on the play here. Quickly mulligans.
Throwing it away.
And Tom appears to be mulling over his 7.
If you're Matt, what is the ideal type of hand you're looking for here, on the play of 6 cards?
I think something along the lines of discard spell, removal spell, Snapcaster Mage, 2 or 3 lands, and something else. Something along those lines. It needs to be cheap and it needs to be fast. You don't have a lot of time.
Is the another problem, in Matt's situation, can he close fast enough after the disruption? Because, his deck has a couple of Vendilion clicks, the Lingering Souls. Once he disrupts Tom, can he pressure him quick enough without Tom assembling the combo again?
Yeah, that's a huge part of the equation here. And, Tom can even actually win kind of at instant speed through crop rotation for a Nexus, untap, and kill you. So
Right.
it's never as safe as it appears.
And Matt leads off here with a Thoughtseize off an Underground Sea. It's almost like we're in Standard again. I saw my fair share of Thoughtseizes yesterday.
Fair number of Glistener Elves here. A Sylvan Library, a Vines of the Vast Wood. Only one land here, but 2 infect creatures for Tom to get the ball rolling.
And Tom had a sort of hand like this against Tan and Grace last round, where he pretty much had all gas but needed a land, and so he can keep very light land hands with this deck.
Now, a feature of Matt's Esper Stoneblade deck that isn't that popular or conventional at this point are 3 copies of Lingering Souls. If he's able to stem the early tide, Lingering Souls is a very powerful tool against a variety of Tom's infect creatures. It's basically just, Blooded Angel can continue to attack. With the assistance of Noble Hierarch, maybe you can cobble something together, but Glistener Elf and Inkmoth Nexus no longer factors if Matt's able to get to that stage of the game.
Shaheen Sarani would be a big fan.
Matt really mulling this over. Takes Blighted Ancient, and I think that's in part because he has Lingering Souls in hand. That's his game plan here.
Tom draws for the turn,
Or
hiding
in
his
deck at least.
hand. The old Reed Duke style of play here.
And it appears Tom has not drawn a land, but he has drawn Noble Hierarch.
And that's what he opts for. Matt cracks the Flooded Strand.
Another potential very powerful opening that Matt can try to assemble here is Stoneforge Mystic into Umezawa's Jitte.
And that is what it looks like he's going for. Let's see if he fetches up here. And you called it.
Umezawa's Jitte in perhaps its best matchup in Legacy is Elves with the plethora of one-toughness creatures that deck produces. Tom's deck possibly even more exposed.
Yes. Every creature with 1 toughness. See what Tom has to do here.
Slyly pulls his hand back.
Not helping us out here.
Now, it is very reasonable that Tom has sided in some of his nature's claims.
Right.
He doesn't know necessarily what he was playing against based on the opening last game, but it was a Esper Stoneblade-ish opening.
Yes. And he already has 1 main deck, which he stressed the importance of last week when I talked with him. And, he has the option of bringing in quite a few more.
He can side into a full playset
Yeah.
in post-board games.
Again, life not mattering, when you're killing with poison. So he's found a Sylvan Library. And another Noble Hierarch.
And this allows Tom to potentially go to a different plan of just attacking with Inkmoth Nessus fueled by Exalted triggers.
We'll see if Matt tries to get the Jitte in play, or...
He's going to go with Lingering Souls, and I really like this play a lot from Matt as it really stunts the angle Tom was trying to take, which is going into the air.
Right.
And now Tom needs to very quickly find answers to this looming Umezawa's Jitte.
Yeah. So those Lingering Souls will clog up any flying shenanigans. Tom, of course, has the die on the top of his library to remind him about the library. Tom's being very secretive with his cards.
Tom, I believe, looking at a Tropical Island, a Noble Hierarch, and a Glistener Elf. 3 cards that provide very little assistance against this looming Jitte.
With that knowledge, Tom's got to be looking for a Nature's Claim here. Still mulling it over here.
Again, hard to overstate how good Umezawa's Jitte is against Tom's deck. As Tom takes all 3 cards.
That is an aggressive move.
Well, Tom's life total not much of a resource in this matchup. If he loses, it's likely to be overwhelmed by card advantage or removal, not because he got nickel and dimed damage-wise out of the game. So
It's a
I
strong
like picking
point.
up all 3.
Yeah, and that is something he did a lot last week too. Not fearing the life loss, get full 3 cards ahead. Going with the Glistener Elf. And a third Noble Hierarch.
So Matt, very quick to just chump block there, saving himself 4 Infect tokens.
Yeah. The triple Exalted here, nothing to scoff at. Of course, Tom's going to have to get through 3 more 1/1s, you know, if Matt chooses to flash back the Lingering Souls.
And Matt critically has found a 4th land, which enables Umezawa's Jitte this turn if he wants to.
Yeah. As he pulls the Jitte to the top of his grip there.
Now Matt has Jitte with Force of Will backup here, which is a pretty comfortable spot, you know. But if you're in Matt's position, it's hard to feel too comfortable here because you know this Infect deck can potentially kill you out of nowhere.
And it looks like he's suiting it up.
So he is using Vines of the Vastwood here in response to give Matt's creature untargetability.
Ooh, tricky.
So let's see if Matt's willing to Force of Will and just go for it here. Vines of the Vastwood. Vastwood, one word.
And he is going to pull the trigger on the Force of Will. Taking a damage here. Make sure his Jitte gets equipped. Swings in there.
Tom looks like he's going to take this hit and try to slog through this Jitte.
All right, 2 counters on the Jitte.
But again, if you're in Matt's seat, you can't feel even too safe in this spot right now. Having the flying blocker back on defense is very helpful, of course. But you know that Tom has a litany of pump spells and you know various effects. It's hard to know for sure that even your 2 counters are enough protection to prevent Tom from killing you this turn.
Tom mulling over his 3 cards from the library here.
Has a Berserk in hand, and if Matt gets sloppy about these Jitte counters, this could just be a lethal attack. Because critically, Berserk gives trample. So it actually gives Tom a way to play over the top of these removal spells. When combined with his Exalted triggers, he might be able to actually generate lethal. You see Tom here.
Brainstorming. Always good to be able to fit a Brainstorm into your aggro deck.
Yep. Tom's deck kind of straddling the line between aggro and combo, so.
Going pretty deep on the deck here.
Well, time is not on Tom's side right now, so, you know, it's incumbent on him to try to end the game really as quickly as he can.
Going down to 2 life. You know.
So we'll see if he's able to cobble together lethal. Tom really going through the permutations of the math right now.
Is this boom or bust for Tom right here? Is there any?
It may not be. Tom has put himself in that position right now by taking those cards with the Sylvan Library. As now he's basically facing down lethal. He does have some chump blockers, but his board position is deteriorating so fast that I think that he is going to do everything in his power to end the game this turn.
Right. You know, after Matt pitched his Force of Will, you know, coast relatively clear other than the flying blocker.
Yeah, Matt's empty-handed, so Tom can do it. He can do it.
There it goes. Gataxian Probe to draw a card, paying the mana to not die. Another Brainstorm here. Misty Rainforest.
Oh, and he just found Invigorate.
Invigorate.
And you see Tom sit up here.
Any poker player knows when someone pulls up in their chair like that.
And I think Tom might just have it now.
Plays his Misty, cracks it.
If Matt lets these Exalted triggers resolve, I mean, he's definitely not going to be a play over the top of Invigorate plus Berserk.
No, that is a lot of power. After getting that deep in his deck, you know, Tom has to have all the options here.
All right, so here it goes.
3 triggers.
In response to Umezawa's Jitte with the triggers on the stack, we see Invigorate.
Invigorate. Another one.
That's a kicked up vines, and that's a berserk,
The
and we are looking at holy moly!
out of nowhere.
Tom Ross going down to 1 life, digging through his deck as hard as he could to assemble the combo in the face of Umezawa's Jitte. Comes across for, I'd have to do the math here, 18. It was 18. No, sorry. It was 4 plus 4 plus 4 times 2 is. It was 20 some odd points of infect damage, and Tom Ross in blistering fast pace are able to take the match against Matt Mansoor, and Tom moves to 6-1.
Through the disruption, through the flying blockers, still gets there with just a